Last year, the Runaways lost in the finals of US Nationals to Iyslander, so this time we vowed that we'd be the ones to master the hero. Fighting back with help from Cody Williams, Lucas Oswald, and Dan Rutkowski, Runaways placed 2 members in the top 8 on good old Bulllander. Let's take a look at the spice to learn how you too can play with ice.
How's everybody doing? I'm Lucas Oswald. I'm going to be going over the deck that myself, Dan Rutkowski, Jesse Kennan, and Cody Williams all played in the Flesh and Blood US Nationals 2023 tournament, with myself and Dan taking it to top 8, and Cody and Jesse having fairly good results with it in the main event and the calling as well. I'm going to start off here with the equipments. You just have your Iyslander, your Waning Moon, your Frostbite token. There's nothing interesting there. Then Cornet Peak, Findall Spring Tunic, Iron Rot, Gauntlet, and Stormstriders. These are the equipments that you're going to be playing in most matchups. Cornet Peak obviously being very versatile, letting you play with 1-card hands, as well as letting you keep Channel Lake Frigid around consistently. Not a whole lot to explain with the other two. Iron Rock Gauntlet, we like this more than Iron Hide Gauntlet. It's more flexible. It doesn't require you to have access to resources to block with. Just the best thing you can be doing right now. And then for some of these sideboard equipments, we have Metacarpus Node. You play this in a lot of matchups aside from just Wizard Mirrors. I play this into Viscerai, Briar, things like that. Basically anything that does arcane damage. And then Alluvian Constellus and Nelrune Hood are basically just for the Wizard Mirrors. Although you can play Alluvian Constellus into Viscerai or Vincent if you want, but it kind of depends on their game plan, which is better. But yep, AB5, you want that for the Wizard Mirrors. Onto the main deck. This isn't exactly a perfect main deck. We don't play these cards into every matchup, but these are the cards that are generally going with the core game plan that we're trying to have. So we got 3 Scar for a Scar, 3 Enlightened Strike, 3 Woundable, 3 Fighting Spirit. There's nothing special here. We're playing Bulllander. These attacks are the most efficient things you can be doing. These being 2-card 8s, E-Strike being super versatile, Scar for a Scar just being one of the greatest cards in the deck. Goes well with Aether Ice Vein, goes well with the attacks. Played 3 red Aether Ice Vein. This is probably the best card in the deck. Triggers your Insidious Chills into aggressive matchups. It's one of the best kill cards. It's so good we even played 2 yellows. We experimented with 3 yellows, but we found out that 2 was fine. You really just want them as your 4th and 5th copies of Red Aether Ice Vein. They let you trigger your Insidious Chills, which is really the most important thing that they do. Blue ice spells, Frosting, Aether Hail, and Ice Bolt. These are really nice. They deal arcane damage as well as giving frostbites, which in a lot of matchups giving frostbites is really important, as well as functioning as kill spells in the late game. For the other damage spells, we got 3 Emeritus Scolding. Obviously, this is just the most damage that you can do on a blue, so if you arsenal this in the end game, it's the best way to kill them Stormstriders. And then 2 Blue Aether Ice Vein. This is a card that traditionally you see played as a 3 of, but we just played 2. It's one of the worst cards in the deck. It's very inefficient. Against anybody with AB3, you're basically trading 2 cards, this card plus the pitch card for one of their blues, and they just completely cover it up. They don't have to discard a card, so it's pretty poor, but it does feel like a card that you have to play in some numbers. It lets you trigger your Insidious Chills on your opponent's turn, which is a really unique effect, as well as just functioning as another damage spell in a pinch. 3 Cold Snap, 3 Polar Blast. These are kind of the bread and butter ice cards. These basically turn 1 card into 3 arcane damage and a Frostbites, as well as letting you filter your hand, and potentially having more effects. Polar Blast on your own turn can be really nice with Dominate, and then Cold Snap, obviously freezing your opponent's arsenal, is really strong. Big card that is one of the best cards into any of the aggressive matchups, Channel Lake Frigid. Think of a deck like Lexi, Briar. They want to be doing 3, 4, 5, sometimes even more than that actions per turn. So this can potentially tax people a whole extra card or 2 cards. Sometimes they just can't play through this card. As well as with Iyslander's ability giving them Frostbite, Channel Lake is just bread and butter. As well as just being a blue 3 black ice card. Probably the actual best card in the deck. Aether Ice Vein is close, but I would contend that it's Insidious Chill combined with Aether Ice Vein. Getting one of these early is basically the whole game plan against Lexi. It's really strong into aggro decks. It's really strong into slower decks, fatigue decks, because you can basically just time walk them. It's a really good way to leak damage. It's a nice card. It's a blue. The card is just so ridiculous. Right, you're basically using 2 of your cards to eventually trade with 3 of their cards, but it does so much more than that. The card is just so good. One card that I was getting asked about a lot was the one of Winter's Grasp. This is actually a card that I played at 3 in Battle Hardened in Atlanta. In past Iyslander decks, you might have seen Brother-in-Arms see play. Brother-in-Arms serves a similar role to this, being a 2-cost 4 attack. It doesn't seem like it's super relevant, but into matchups like Dromai and the Mirror, that can actually come up. I played one game against Dromai this weekend. I played against Fino, and I did attack with my one of Winter's Grasp to kill a Thamai, so it actually comes in clutch. But then the reason that we play Winter's Grasp over Brother-in-Arms is because it's a more consistent card. Being a 3-block instead of a 2-block that can block 4 is much more consistent and versatile. And then also being an extra ice card in the deck is really nice. We ended up cutting the 2nd and 3rd one for Warmonger's Diplomacy, which we'll talk about in a second. But Winter's Grasp is one of my favorite cards, and yeah, definitely a cool addition to the deck. Then we played 3 Brain Freeze. This is one of the best cards against aggressive decks, things like Briar, Fi, Katsu, as well as being pretty reasonable into Lexi. It's a way to trigger your Insidious Chills again, which is important. Chill is really strong, but if you're not actually able to fuse anything relevant, it doesn't really do anything. And then it's also just a 3-block. It turns on your Waning Moon. It's a pretty reasonable turn 1 play as well, just looking at their hand. So Brain Freeze, just good flexible card, and it's kind of hard to cut this if you think you might play against some number of things like Fi, Briar, Katsu, things like that. Then we have the Frost Hexes and the Ice Eternals. Some of these get trimmed into a lot of the more aggressive decks, but they are ultimately really important against any fatigue strategies like the Fatigue Briar that we saw, or just any slow deck really. Setting up a Frost Hex into an Ice Eternal play can get big damage. And then they're obviously both just blue 3-blocks. Ice Eternal has the potential to get played for a little bit of value, and then Frost Hex is a nice card, so there's really strong blues. And then the last card that we play in this slot is Warmonger's Diplomacy. This is a card that we tested on and off. We cut it for a while because obviously the Lexi players just have Trench, so it's never going to end their turn by making them not be able to flip their arsenal. But it prevents Codex, it prevents 3 of a kind, and those are the 2 best cards in their deck. It also prevents Icequake, which is one of the other best cards. If you watch my stream game against Evan, Icequake came in handy a lot there. It also came in handy in my game against him in Swiss, so Warmongers can stop that. And then it also just gives you extra game into things like Azalea, Viserai, Briar, even Minset. Any of these slightly less play strategies, but that can definitely pop up and cause you problems. This card just makes those matchups even better. Personally, I wasn't a huge fan of Warmonger's Diplomacy, but I know that some of my teammates had really good success with it. So yeah, Warmongers. Then onto the sideboard. Again, this isn't an exact sideboard. We don't play, we do have a lot of these cards in more than others, but these are more tech-specific cards. Blizzard, this is one of the strongest cards in the deck against any deck that attacks you more than once. Just the ability to potentially end a turn with this card is really strong against Lexi, Briar, Fi, Katsu, Viserai, all these decks I've been talking about, Dromai even. This card is just incredibly strong. This is actually the reason that I beat Fino in our game, was I had a really clutch Blizzard, and he had to pay so many resources to pay for it that he ended up actually just dying to my Storm Striders. 3 Command and Conquers. Initially this card was in the deck for Lexi, but eventually we realized that with a lot of the Lexis cutting Icequakes and Ice cards in general, playing a lot more 3-blocks and arrows, we actually don't really want this card in that matchup. It just gets blocked by 2 cards, which is okay, but that's really not what we're trying to do in the matchup. We want to deal damage. That being said, this card is phenomenal in the mirror. It's phenomenal against Dromai. Having 9 poppers against Dromai is really big game. It makes it to where you can consistently draw poppers. It also makes it to where you'll have hands more often where you can pop with a popper and then attack them with a popper. because even though your Woundables and Fighting Spirits do pop their dragons, it's really important still to be able to attack them with them, so you can actually get damage through. So having more, other poppers that just get rid of a dragon is really nice. And then in the mirror, this card's really strong. Just having any more attacks you can get your hands on in the mirror is good. But this one has the nice added bonus of leaving you with 1 resource floating. It lets you play something like an Enlightened Strike with Go Again, and be able to play around a Frostbite. And then it also is really good when you just attack them for 6, because if they respond with a spell or a Waning Moon, then you can pay your 1 floating and get an Illuvian Constellus counter. So this card can be really strong there. Also, the mirror just has a lot of 2 blocks, so sometimes you can just get them with this. I did actually play one of these and destroy an Arsenal card in the mirror one time this weekend, which is just so good. The mirror is all about value, so if you can actually destroy an Arsenal with this card, it's phenomenal. Then we have 5 defense reactions, 3 sinks, 2 fates. The sinks are in basically any matchup that attacks you. The exceptions being the mirror, Dromai, and maybe a couple others, but for the most part, Sink Below's in the deck. Fate Foreseen is a little more targeted. You play this against things like Lexi that are attacking you consistently with breakpoints that you need to cover up. This card is a bit of a necessary evil. Adding more reds in the deck is not something you actively want to do, but you kind of have to. Just being able to block 4 instead of 3 is so huge against, they're 0 for 4s, or combined with your gauntlets, something like a Heat Seeker, Infecting Shot. Yeah, it's really important. As well as having extra game into things like Bravo. Having more defense reactions in that matchup is really nice. It means it's much less likely that you'll just get dominated and die. And then the mirror tech that we have 3 energy potions. This is one of the best cards in the mirror. It lets you pay for Insidious Chill, and then every turn it basically just says you're 2 life points higher, as well as being a blue card that turns on your Waning Moon. And then the other card that we played for the mirror was Sigil of Solace. I played 3 of this in Atlanta. I really liked it. I kind of wish we had space for 3, but I think that we only had space for 2 at the end. I think it was correct. But if you have more mirrors in your area, I would recommend playing this card. One thing about the mirror that will often happen is you get towards the late game, and both players stop drawing attacks, and they're kind of just trying to play, jockey for position, play Frost Hexes, play Channeling Frigids, and this is just a great way to passively gain life. I had a mirror where this happened in Atlanta, I believe it was, and I just played 3 sigils 3 turns in a row while neither one of us was doing anything, and it took a completely even game to a game where I was just up 9 life. And then it's also really nice 1-card hand in the mirror, which is pretty rare. Generally in the mirror you don't have good 1-card hands. And yeah, it's super versatile. It also extends your opponent's kill range. So, for example, one problem that you'll have sometimes in the mirror is, you can't, let's say you're at, 10 life, and, your opponent is representing 13 damage. You can't play all your cards, but if you have a card in Arsenal and they know you're playing Sigil, they might not be able to go for it, because they'll just lose if they pop their Storm Striders and then you just Sigil and you live. So just having it in your deck is a really nice threat. And then there are a few other matchups I know where some of my teammates played it. You could potentially play it into Bravo, something like that, in set. Yeah, so Sigil, super versatile card. I love it. That's it for the deck. Yeah, thanks for watching.
Thanks, Lucas, for running through the deck there. Now, what we're going to talk about with Iyslander is kind of the play patterns, the play lines of the deck. Iyslander's a lot different than most decks because on its own turn, it plays pretty straight up. However, on its opponent's turn, it plays vastly differently than a lot of other decks. So what we're actually going to be covering is why we play Iyslander and what the deck's actually trying to do. Why are we playing attacks in the deck? And then what are we arsenaling and what does it mean when we arsenal those cards? So the way Iyslander wins the game, what the deck's actually trying to do is we're trying to play a bunch of cards that are above rate. And we spoke in a previous video about the expected value for each card that you play is 3 points of value. What we're going to do with Iyslander is we're going to play all of our cards, as many as possible, above that rate. And that's going to be where we get most of our wins from. While we're doing that, we'll also be slowing down our opponent so they can't take full turns in the way that they expect to. And then we want our health total and our opponent's health total to both be going down relatively at the same rate. What that allows us to do is then on our last turn of the game, on our opponent's turn, we can play Storm Striders, play a card from our hand, and we're effectively getting an extra turn over our opponent. So let's talk about why we're actually playing attacks in this deck. And there's two main reasons. One, these attacks are well above value. So we're talking about Wounded Bull, we're talking about Fighting Spirit. Both of these attacks are true 2-for-8s. They're 2 because you play the card, pitch a card, that's 2 cards that you're using, and you get 8 value when you play it. When you play Wounded Bull, it's going to attack for 8. We're almost always having this effect. So that's a 2-for-8, that's above rate. You play a Fighting Spirit, you're attacking for 7 and you're healing for 1. That is also a true 2-for-8. These cards are pretty much unmatched, and they're a high value. Now, the other 2 attacks that we're playing are Enlightened Strike and Scar for Scar. These are a little different. E-Strike, for the most part, is what I would call like a soft 2-for-8. The reason for that is most of the time when you're playing this, you're blocking with 2 cards on your opponent's turn. You're playing this on your round, and you're going to draw a card. That allows you to then set a card to move in the next turn. But as we talked about, this is swinging for 5, and we're drawing a card to set. So that's 3 value, because every card is worth about 3. So it'd be like a soft 2-for-8. And Scar for Scar is a 1-for-4, which is above the normal value threshold. But at the same time, it does allow you then to combo into some of these cards and have like a 3-for-12. So that's the first reason we're playing attacks. Now the second reason we're playing attacks, and this is the part that like most people that I work with or I teach how to play Iyslander, they feel a little bit uncomfortable. They're like, yeah, it's cool throwing like an 8 damage, but this is not the whole effect of why we're playing attacks in this. When you throw a 2-for-8, your opponent's going to make 2 decisions. They're going to take the damage because they want to throw it at you, and that's fine for us because most of the time when we're blocking on our opponent's turn and playing our cards on our opponent's turn, we're getting some level of value and we're blocking. And so we're usually out trading them. We're trading them pretty even by playing this and them just taking the 8. But the other reason we're playing this is so that they block. When you throw an 8 damage at your opponent, when they get in that 20 mark, they're really going to want to be blocking. And when they're blocking, they're giving up 2 cards out of their hand, which then allows when we're playing on their round, it allows it a lot easier for us to control them, stop them from what they're doing, and also take a lot less damage. So them blocking is great for us. Them not blocking is also good for us. So we're playing these because it's a win-win situation on our end, and most of the time your opponent is going to end up blocking this, which then makes your job of controlling them on their turn far easier. Okay, so now for the real core of Iyslander. And this is the part that I see most people struggle with. It's why are we arsenaling the card and what are we arsenaling? And most people make a lot of mistakes in this category and they don't even realize it, and it causes them to lose games. But there's real tangible reasons why when you're looking at your 4 cards, you're sitting there, your opponent's coming with attacks, there are certain cards you block with, and there's certain cards you're holding for the next round in the arsenal. There's a big reason for each of these, and each of these means something different. So I kind of broke these up into different categories. We're going to kind of go through them one by one. So the first ones I want to talk about are the cantrips. And cantrip simply means that the card replaces itself when you play it. And so let's look at Cold Snap here. We're going to ignore the first part that says it freezes the arsenal. It's a very good effect, but it doesn't matter for what we're talking about now. Essentially what this card is, when we're going to want to set this card, the reason we're going to do that is because it replaces itself. Essentially, it turns into a block into your hand while dealing 3 damage. You're essentially trading 3 to your opponent to also block with your opponent. So why would we set this, or when would we want to set this? Most people would say all the time because it's a super good card, but that's not actually accurate. We want to set this when we don't have a ton of good control options, when we want to be able to push our Waning Moon to trade damage when we're in the race of lowering each other's health. But while your opponent is probably going to have a good turn, we definitely want to be, setting this type of card. This allows us to block more. And we'll walk through kind of how it looks. You set this, you go to your opponent's turn, right? They play an action. Typically, most of the time on their first action, you're going to end up playing this card from Arsenal. You're going to pitch a card. You'll have 2 floating. You're going to draw a card, so you still have 4 cards in your hand. Because you still have 4 cards in your hand, you can easily block with 2, 3 of those cards and still have a card to set on your next round. So this card essentially replaces itself, unlike a lot of the other cards when you try to play them for the arsenal, and it still gets in for that Waning Moon for 3, but on top of that, it even creates a Frostbite. That's the whole point of the deck, is try to create a Frostbite to try and slow down your opponent enough that they get trapped with an extra card, or they have to pitch an extra card and they can't arsenal. Essentially, every time your opponent either can't arsenal because they had to overpitch because you created frostbites, or they had to stop their turn early and hold extra cards in their hand, you're gaining 3 value. And that's essentially what we're trying to do the whole time. So when we're looking at these cantrip ones, the reason we're playing these in this situation is what we want to be able to do is block with an extra card. Every time I'm setting this, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going to set this, I'm planning on my next round to be able to block with 3 or 2 cards. Now for some of my favorite cards, which are the 2-cost cards. And a lot of people are either set these incorrectly or don't set them often enough. And the rule of thumb for your 2-cost cards, we're going to take Channel Lake out of this because while this is still how you want to play your Channel Lake in a perfect world, in some matchups you do need to play Channel Lake as soon as you draw it. You just draw it, you set it, you play it no matter what. However, in a perfect world, this is also how you'd play your Channel Lake. The times that you want to keep this card to set and not block with it is when your Tunic is on 2 on your opponent's turn. Quite simply, every time this Tunic is about to tick up to 3, you want to be setting a 2-cost card if possible. The reason for that is it allows you on your opponent's turn, let's say we set this Ice Bolt here. On our opponent's turn, we play the Ice Bolt, we pitch a card, we get to remove our Tunic and Waning Moon. Essentially, what that allows us to do, for 1 card out of our hand, we deal 6 damage and create a Frostbite. With Scolding, we're going to deal 7 damage, which is great. It's great to be able to deal 7 damage or to deal 6 damage on our opponent's turn, especially when we're only pitching 1 card for that. Super efficient, and that's how we're trying to play the games, incredibly efficient. Same with Channel. If you can Channel while your Tunic is up, that's the best Channel time. You're really going to get your opponent in a tough spot when you're able to play the Channel and deal 3 damage. That's great. And that's what I'm looking for. Every time I see this card in my hand, the first thing I do is I look at my Tunic. What number am I on? Maybe I'm already on 3. I'm 100% trying to save one of these to throw it. If my Tunic's on 2, I'm 100% trying to keep one of these to throw it. If my Tunic's on 1, I'm blocking. This is not my set card. My Tunic's on 1, I'm never trying to set, with the exception of Channel Lake, because in some matchups you have to. If my Tunic is on 1, I am never setting these cards. It makes playing the deck, it makes thinking through playlines a lot easier when you just have that heuristic to look at. You're like, Tunic's on 1, these block. Or these are my pitch card. And I'm going to try and set a different card, right? Maybe I'm still in the Cold Snap Polar Blast line at that point in time. Now, for what I think is the most underutilized card, and this is Hail. I love setting Hail. A lot of people don't set it very often. They use it to block. It does have a block 3, which is great. But every time I set Hail, you get to push 5 damage. And the times that I really want to set this is when I just had an attack. I love setting this after attack. So if I Wounded Bull them, and then I have a Hail to set, that's like my favorite time to set it, because I know that most of the time I swung an 8, I stripped 2 cards out of their hand, and then I get to swing for 5, and I know most of this 5, if not all of it, is going to connect as well. Feels so good. This is also how you push damage when your Tunic is not on 3. So let's say my hand looks something like this. I have these 2 in my hand. My Tunic is sitting here on 1. This is great. I need to push damage. I need to make that race where both of our health is going lower at the same time. I get to block with Ice Bolt. I get to set the Hail, and I'm super happy about that. Likewise, if my Tunic's on 2, we just talked about this, I'm going to block with the Hail. I'm going to set the Ice Bolt instead, because I know I want to spin my Tunic when it hits 3. I think this card is very underutilized. This is a card that you can set almost any time, and you're pretty happy about it. And also, this is the card that I always want to have a damage spell after I strip cards out of my opponent's hand, even if I'm using like an Ice Vein to do that. Then I definitely want to be setting a damage spell, and this is one of the best ones for you to set, because it doesn't matter where your Tunic is at, you can always get your 5 damage out of it. Okay, let's talk about the problem children. These cards over here are what I would consider the problem children of the deck. These cards will lose you games if you're not too careful with them. Let's go through them a little bit. First of all, this one's easy. It's Hex. Never set Hex. I don't care what you've heard. I don't care what you've been told. This card is trash. This card is absolutely terrible. The only time you're using this card is sometimes in the mirror, and if your opponent is hard fatiguing you. That is not most of the time. This card should never be set. This card loses you the game if you set it. It costs 3 to play, it is highly inefficient, and it'll just sit there the whole game. It'll sit in your arsenal, it'll eat up a card. You'd rather block with a card than play this. If you are stuck with this card at the end of your turn, you do not arsenal it. You use it to Waning Moon. Or you pitch the Peak. Those are 2 options. Never set Frost Hex. Okay, we're all clear. That is trash. Trash card. In a similar vein, Ice Eternal. In most matchups, this card is a trash can. It has some play at the end of the game. There are some cycles where you'll set it. It's very good in fatigue decks. If they're trying to fatigue you, this is a win condition. But most of the time, do not set this card. It is not as bad as Frost Hex, because you can at least play it for nothing. So that's some level of value, I guess. However, most of the time I would not set this card. I would Waning Moon with this card, or I would find a different card to try and set here. We're just going to make your life easy and say, do not set Ice Eternal, except for some weird in-game scenarios in which you're willing to just burn your whole hand to play this. In the early game, you really never want to be setting Ice Eternal. Aether Vein. Blue. This is a risky card to set. I do not like setting this card. Every time you set this card, you are asking to pitch an entire card and fuse it for 3 damage. We don't want to do that. We could pitch a whole card to get 5 damage and a Frostbite. This doesn't even create a Frostbite. Now, it does, in a lot of circumstances, maybe get a card out of your opponent's hand, but it's very risky. I do not like setting Blue Ice Veins. There are some matchups you have to. I would recommend trying to not set this card until you've played the deck a lot, and you'll see a couple of weird circumstances where you set it. But most of the time, this is a blocking card. This is a pitching card. This is not a card for setting. Frosting is like the opposite of those. You will most of the time not lose the game because you set a Frosting. However, it won't do anything. It's just like, it's more of a bluff than it is a real card. It does create a Frostbite, so like that's a bonus. It does deal, I guess, 1 damage. But you're never really playing the Frosting and then Waning Mooning, because it's not really worth it. You'd rather just block for 3 most of the time instead of pitching the card to Waning Moon. It is essentially a 1 card or a no card get a Frostbite. So this is not terrible to set. You're not very happy to set it, but it's not going to sit there the whole time and stay in your arsenal and get stuck like these other 3 will over here. So it's not a big deal, but it's not really something that you want to actively be setting, but it's not going to kill you. Insidious Chill. Man, Insidious Chill. This card is so good and so terrible all at the same time. This card will single-handedly win you the game and lose you the game, essentially at the same time. Every time you play an Insidious Chill, whether you play it on your turn, whether you set it to then play it, you lose essentially all of your momentum. Most of the time what this means is that if you play this Insidious Chill, your opponent is probably going to have 5 cards to hit you with, because you didn't do anything to slow them down. Now, sometimes you get away with like playing a Wounded Bull, they block with 2 cards, you get to set this, and then you're buying, essentially buying your turn that way. That is probably the best time to play the Insidious Chill. But I want you to understand that you do not need Insidious Chill to win the game. You can easily play 0 Insidious Chills and still win most of your games. If you see this early and you can play it in a way where you're not taking 20, 25 points of damage to try and set it, it's great to play. Whether you hold the cards to play it on your turn, whether you're setting it to play it. However, this is probably the hardest card in the deck to play, because sometimes you'll take 10 damage, you'll play this card, and it'll do nothing for the game, and you'll essentially lost because you attempted to play an Insidious Chill. Sometimes you'll play the Insidious Chill, you'll take 15 points of damage, and this will still win you the game because you'll play enough Ice Veins that you get enough value from it. So there isn't a good rule of thumb. Typically what I try and do is, if I can get away with giving away like 10 health to play this card, I will typically do it. If it's turn 1, 2, 3 of the game, I will try and play this card as often as I can. Once it starts getting past that point, I'll almost never play Insidious Chill. And that's really the crux of the deck. The games where you get this out early, you typically win pretty easily. The games that you don't get this out early, you still can win. It's a little bit harder, but at any time you try and force this out, you could be throwing the game away. So this is the card you really have to be very careful about. And just to wrap this up, while Iyslander might feel like a very overwhelming deck to play when you're first picking it up, it's incredibly rewarding. The deck is extremely consistent, and the deck feels like you always have a chance to win. And I would recommend anyone pick this up, give it a shot, stick with it a little bit. Once you start to get the play patterns down, it gets a lot easier. And it's a great deck to have in your repertoire, whether you want to bring it to a tournament or you want to understand how to beat it.